Thank you very much, Dr. Bieberstein-Koch-Weser, for the most interesting lecture. And this is really a huge problem, but as we heard, it also can be solved if there is a will, so there is a way. And one important lesson I would like to take from this is that the sustainable use of resources indeed has to go hand in hand with the social sustainability as well. So we have to take the people into consideration and work with them. And thank you very much. Now I would like to invite both of our speakers to the podium here, please, and then I will open the floor for questions and comments to all of you. Please present yourself, your name and where you come from, even if I know you, but maybe not everybody.
Thank you for two excellent presentations. I think I would like to go back to the German case because it's very instructive, as you say. And I would like to ask, when was it actually realized that the 2020 target is escaping? And if so, was it kind of a calculated, cynical calculation in the first place, or was it by unpleasant surprise, so that there was this kind of unrealization of targets that were placed, or was it kind of miscalculation? I would like to hear a short elaboration on this, because I think it's extremely instructive in understanding the challenges that are ahead. Thank you.
It's actually not easy to answer. I think it's a bit of both. Clearly, and we see this in many countries, to comply with international agreements or election platforms, we set very ambitious targets. And then the politics, the daily politics, or the diversion of other big burning items, particularly when it comes to long-term commitments such as climate, take priority. I think in Germany they realized there was, of course, and secondly, a bit of game playing, of course, which is not bad, where the environmental ministry and Green Party and some state governments asked for this ambition 2020, and other parties said, well, let them set the objectives, we make the decisions on actual action later, and then we'll have the political debate again. And then there was, of course, the European Union and its targets and others, and we know also in other European Union targets they're not always fulfilled. I think it dawned on them three years ago that this was not on a good path, particularly on lignite coal, which I elaborated on, because what you really would have had to do before 2020 is to at least take 7 or up to 10 tons of lignites out of operation to leave that. And that's what, of course, is frustrating also with this commission. It will probably not be in the curve, in the path, be ambitious enough to still need that. I think it's a good example, as you say, of theory of change on how things don't happen. And that's why I have some hope that this law, I emphasize law, that is now going to be passed this year, if it is meaningful at all, and of course there are question marks too, that's different. I mean, that's now law, and you can go before the courts, will work differently. I think laws also help you to do what I believe greatly in, and we are also supporting as European Climate Foundations, is litigation. In America, for example, more coal-fired power plants, even in this present political environment, have gone out of service because of litigation on pollution reasons or whatever. And Client Earth, which is a great NGO, is basically specializing in that. Excellent lawyers, and they develop these cases and they know how to do it, and they win usually. We started in America. We are introducing them in Europe now also, including in Germany. But I guess the short answer is it was a combination of those factors. And hopefully a lesson has been learned, because the 2030 targets are very ambitious too. And unless we get moving very fast, I talked about coal, but the same on mobility. I don't quite see how you can do that just to even a carbon price alone, unless you have, like the Chinese are doing, EV quotas for cities in place to achieve that. The price, I praised the carbon price, but I'm afraid there are some areas where pricing, which as an economist very much believe in, will not do the incentive work alone. Take air travel. I doubt we can have high enough a carbon price to reduce aviation trips taken over price, even if tickets are much more expensive. People love to fly and probably even pay more. It will not be the EasyJet trip for 50 euros a weekend to Mallorca, but still very significant. And when I talked about behavioral change, it has to be more than incentives that drive that. And that's education, and that's laws.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Thank you. This was so refreshing to listen to both of you. Even
Elizabeth, would you like to take the mic? Because
I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Yes, my name is Elizabeth Rehn, and I was really feeling so refreshed by listening to both of you, and got a lot of new knowledge too. But having this frog, beautiful frog, in front of me, I wonder, as this is one of the very important questions for the elections to come in Finland, is it possible to make the really exact percentages of how much you can cut and still have it renewed so that we can keep the lungs? Or is that a play of some guesses where you can just express your own opinion?
It's not so easy, because in each ecological subsystem, a balance has to be kept. Some of the mistakes which were made in the 1980s, you can see today from a satellite. If you go to northwestern Brazilian Amazon, the state of Rondônia, you see the typical pattern how it was developed. A trunk road in the middle of the state. It is a state the size of Germany. And then from this trunk road, side roads go out. And from the side roads, little roads go out. It's called a fishbone pattern. Now, if you do that, in aggregate, you can still say there is still some forest in Rondônia, but the forest for the ecosystem is not worthless, but almost worthless, because no large jaguar, which needs a huge contiguous area, many animal species just cannot survive on these small scattered forest patches. That's why, as a symbol, I showed you the indigenous. It's not just the settlement, but what the Indios do is, so they take this huge stretch of forest, and then they do a garden over here, an opening, a garden over there, and so on. And after a few years, when the fertility goes down, because the humus layer in the Amazon is typically, there are different places, but it's typically very thin. So they can use it for a few years, they abandon it, and you see how the forest, with all its diversity, closes in again. So it's not just a matter of quantity, but how. The how was planned even in the 1980s. For instance, to only open patches where soil studies had shown that these were very fertile special soils, worthwhile, quote unquote. That experiment also, to a large measure, went wrong, because they open this, they make the access roads, and other, if you allow poor devils of people who have no land, the movement of the landless in Brazil, they come by busloads and they clear the rest. So it is a technical question, a planning question, but also very much a social strategy which has to come in. But surely, on the basis of the indigenous cultures, we can see that it's not untouchable, but it needs to be dealt with a lot of discrimination and criteria, and not as a fishbone.
Thank you. I think Peter, you are next.
Thank you, Peter from Aue University. So my question would be to Mr. Koch-Weser, to your three excellent points at the very end of your presentation. I will pick the carbon pricing. I look at it from a slightly different viewpoint, from the climate justice point of view. Maybe if you have a CO2 tax, it actually gives you the legal right to emit as long as you pay. So if you can afford, so you can emit, and you don't need to change anything. But those people who can't afford, they have to change. And thinking that half of the people on this globe are very poor, so they have to take much more the burden of reducing CO2 emissions. So my question would be, how should we plan the CO2 taxing and pricing system in a way that it would not increase in inequality and injustice, but would be just for every person on this globe?
Not an easy question.
Another difficult question. Generally, and I think that went wrong with Macron in recent weeks, if you start carbon pricing, taxing, without having thought through very clearly the incidence, the impact, particularly on different population groups, and how you can compensate the vulnerable in reasonable and just ways, you shouldn't start. And he started without having thought that through. I think the incentive effect, obviously, you have if it applies to everybody. But one answer to your question is that you can generously compensate, whether it's income transfers or in many other ways, the vulnerable for what they paid more. They would still use less fossil fuel, for example, but they are, in terms of their income available for other purposes, would be compensated. Now, you can also, of course, in tax theory, you can tax differently different kinds of activities. But my broader point is really you need a just transition framework in carbon pricing right from the outset, and be willing to compensate generously. I mean, because otherwise it becomes regressive, of course, as you say. And it should not, and it doesn't have to be. There also the combination of what you do through emissions trading, which you can limit to the companies, etc., and what you do through straight taxing. I mean, there are many variations on the theme, and I'm encouraged that a lot of this experimenting is going on. But it is, just transition is a big theme. Mary Robinson, who is on our board of the European Climate Foundation, she always reminds us, and we are developing this capability now much more in-house, on how you design decarbonization strategies, not only on carbon tax, that take this just transition centrally into consideration. Of course, needless to say, in the emerging markets and the poor countries, that's an absolute must.
Thank you. I have a few names on my list. President Talo, please.
Yes, so my name is Tarja Haanen, and I now mentioned that I'm the former president of the country. I'm also quite actively working with the United Nations in Sustainable Solution Network and many other places, but also I'm the chair of the Helsinki University. So my question is that I was very interested about your optimism concerning the markets and the business community. And I too, even my background is I'm social democrat, so that I think also that now they seem to be so that there are the countries where the business community is more progressive than the political leaders. But then there are also the countries where the political leaders are much more progressive than the business community. So you cannot put them in the silos, but it's important to see that entity, the comprehensive picture, and also in sustainable development. But now Germany has had a very big role in the European processes and also in European Union. So how do you see now the possibilities for the European Union to be more effective? I'm not saying the leading role because it's not very democratic, but have a bigger, stronger role in sustainable development process in this kind of political situation that we have today in Europe. I hope that you will encourage us. We will have elections in a couple of months.
Well, first of all, you need leaders among the politicians, and at least Macron is trying to be such a leader. I hope very much, and this in other areas, that of the Aachen Agreement they signed, Merkel and Macron, will lead to action. It's not, I'll specifically mention joint French-German action, for example, on carbon pricing, as the French are proposing, but Germany has took some distance to travel before they get there. I think Europe, particularly with the Nordic countries, Finland of course included, pushing hard, with Germany and France willing to move, could in the coming years play a stronger role again. But I sounded the pessimistic view that not much has happened in recent years in Germany, and it really remains an open question, particularly for the Social Democrats in Germany, to what extent they make this central plank the future. The Social Democratic Party in Germany is now at 14% of the vote. I served in a red-green coalition. What a difference to then. The Greens are now at 19%, larger than Social Democrats. And I believe, as many others in the Social Democratic Party believe, that the way forward is to be very strong and risk losing some voters, but be very strong on big progress on Europe and big progress on sustainability as the way out for the Social Democrats, not leave it to the Greens and others. But whether this coalition, CDU and SPD, will move forcefully, this law this year will show. Let's see when it hits the cabinet what to be done to reach the 2030 targets, 2050 targets, will in the end be divided. I think it's an open question. Europe, of course, together with China, I mentioned California, it will be ideal coalitions in many of these areas. And the message that we tried to put forward in our Better Growth, Better Climate report has to be further internalized. I truly believe that the growth champions of the next decades in the business community are those who take sustainability fully on board, and not the others. It's just the opposite. And it can be done without less growth and without higher quality of growth and the same rate of growth as otherwise. And I agree with you, as I also said, the business community in many cases is now further ahead than the governments. And that dynamic to play, we are trying to work very much with the business community now, not just governments as European Climate Foundation, because you find many allies there who are far-sighted enough to push that. And maybe even the German automotive industry will see light at the end of the tunnel instead of cheating.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a few people on my list, but Maria Makarov is the next one, and then we turn to the business side here, and then I saw a few hands over there as well. So, yeah, please, Maria.
Thank you, Maria Makarov of Aue-Säätiö, Finland. Going back to Madame von Bieberstein's presentation, the knowledge that has been obtained of the negative impact of clear-cutting in the Amazon, how can that be translated to the Finnish situation? Here, clear-cutting in Finland is still in practice.
Please.
Well, I don't know enough about Finnish forests, but clear-cutting in rainforest environments means you lay bare a ground which is not largely not apt for sustained agriculture. It can sustain agriculture for a few years, and then it is so depleted that you have to use so many inputs that it becomes too costly to use it. So what you can see, maybe you remember there was this one slide where I said, well, this is what the countryside looks like after the burning and when it's been turned into agriculture. Well, it's a very arid, low-value soil, and what we see in Brazil now is a lot of abandoned land. You get so-called woody weeds, which, something grows there, but it's the wrong stuff, and the cow can't even eat it. So it's abandoned. So there are big programs now to say, how can we complement in Brazil the maintenance, so we hope, of forests with afforestation around. So in terms of the ecology and the biodiversity, I think it's a much more complicated case than maybe the complications you have here in Finland. I would not like to really make a direct link, because these are different environments.
Thank you. Now I have Henrik Andrew.
My name is Henrik Andrew. I'm chairman of Progressive industry-founded NGO. And we very much agree with both speakers. I have a question regarding Brazil. How do you see the new government in the context of Amazon?
You start.
I start and Caio continues. Of course, if you have a company like we have, the build-up of environmental legislation, of careful environmental impact assessment methodologies in Brazil. If you have already been worried last year about changes into the forestry code of Brazil, very important changes, then you can't be delighted about the things that this government says. This is national. The statistics are manipulated. We only use 10% of our soil for agriculture, but yet we are one of the biggest agricultural exporters on earth. And we have every right to clear-cut forest and do more agriculture. This is what they say. The funds for NGOs have been put on hold for 3 months. No payments can go out. The government will, very much in the style that's reminiscent of the days when we were students in Brazil and the military regime was afoot, they will study what we do. Climate change, I think, was termed by the environment minister as a sort of communist invention. So I don't want to go on with all my delights, but that's the view.
Well, when you look back, you had Brazil long years under military regime, and then very fortunately, also in light with international trends, you had fairly enlightened leadership in the 90s that stopped the boom-bust, highly inflation, recession kind of cycles. And with President Cardoso, a very enlightened leader who put the economic house in order, and with also good social, education and other policies. That built a reputation. Brazil became, again, a major investment address for the international community. Then came Lula. And Lula, whom I knew personally quite well, started well. He was smart enough to continue the stabilization and many of the economic policies of his predecessor. He added actually a number of social policies like stipends for poor families when they send their kids to school, and to health posts to get medical preventive care, and many other things. But Lula in his second term then was all downhill. partly because this enormous corruption scandal. You have to understand there was a workers' party, poor party obviously by definition, who now had the government coffers, and particularly Petrobras, which is a huge oil company nationally owned by government ownership, was such an opportunity to put money aside, so to speak, build a war chest. This became terrible. I mean, with billions of corruption and not just millions. And economic policies, I often told Lula, you have to do the pension reform, you have to do some of the social reforms. In fact, they don't hit the poorest, they hit, if anything, they're costly to the middle class. You should less worry about, but do it. He did not. So then it was downhill to an extent where we had poor economic performance, actually a recession in Brazil, and we had huge corruption, basically penetrating the entire economic and social system. And now comes Bolsonaro as an effect, I mean, very cleverly, although he might also have some corruption in the family, as is now coming out, use that a bit a la Trump of Latin America, of saying, well, I'm with you, we have to clean up this. The other big issue became security in inner cities. The drug gangs, actually Brazil is a major hub for narcotic traffic out of Latin America, and so on. So people felt insecure, they felt hit by the recession. No surprise, he was elected, but totally unprepared. Coming from close to the military, he was in the military himself, and without any concepts really on what to do. With the one exception of his super minister for economic finance, who is a Chicago-trained economist, Guedes, who tries to do a bit what Pinochet tried to do or did in Chile. But I think from a purely economic point of view, with the right concepts on regulation, on reviving economy that are quite good, pension reform, stamping out corruption. So that's the business community as a result reacts favorably, but it's also wait and see. But on the themes we are discussing here tonight, it's fairly disastrous because he has some people in there who, for nationalistic, not even out of a deep understanding or skepticism, but basically because that's what Trump did and that's what makes them famous, go in crazy directions. What to do? I think we have to, in these early days, in fact, what little we can contribute, we are going to Brazil next week, engage, international community has to engage. In Davos there were some discussions already with Bolsonaro and his ministers by people like Paul Porman, the head of Unilever, who was a great environmentalist, and we work together closely. So begin to engage with them. I see, funnily enough, the military as a target group. Bolsonaro was basically elected by the evangelicals, who are very strong now in Latin America, and unfortunately now not like the Catholic Pope, very pro-mitigating climate. They come from a very different angle. He was elected by the agribusiness, and he was elected by the military. And the military has longer-term strategic visions for the country. What resonates with them make Brazil powerful, growing, a major power in the international context. And I think talking to the military, that there is a huge environment, Maritta talked about, environmental patrimony, asset, that Brazil, more than other countries in the world, has. Land mass, land quality, water, forests, biodiversity. And that needs preservation for a big, growing, powerful Brazil of the future. Will resonate with the military more than the other groups who elected him. This is partly speculative, but we are trying to get access to the strategic thinkers in the military. Brazil has a particularly good military. I mean, they have good military schools, their staff, the central staff is good. I don't know. But at the moment, it's a very, very difficult situation which can go easily wrong. A tragedy in a sense. After what Cardoso started, Lula first continued. and now it was all downhill again.
Thank you for the analysis, and I think the next one is, please.
My name is Mika, and I'm chairman of ST1, and I try to deliver solutions to make this fossil system to renewable. My question is related to EU and our rules, how we try to play our role in the planet. And before I can ask the question, I have to describe a little bit what we have to do and what kind of actions are taken in the real life right now. As we all know, EU is only 10% of the CO2 emissions of the world. And in next 10 years, another region, based on the investments, last year, for example, fossil investments were still on the energy sector 70%. We know as a fact that emissions in other regions are growing more than EU emissions are today in next 10 years. That is not opinion, that's the fact. So inside EU, we are making a lot of different type of actions where we do think that we are making things better, and we are not really making things any better. Our calculations are quite badly wrong. We are buying now from China used cooking oil based biodiesel. We will put that into Swedish cars, and that will cost us €220 per CO2 ton. I asked from the Swedish politicians that is it a really sensible thing to do? We are making now investment to Gothenburg for biodiesel refinery. It will cost €200 million, and we have to do that because we are mandated. Company like we are heavily mandated, most likely highest in the planet, and we have to take these used cooking oils from China, from animal fat, from South America, different kind of raw materials into Europe because of these mandates. My question is that why can't we act globally? It would make a lot of more sense to use this money elsewhere. Build up electricity system, for example, based on solar into Africa villages, or do some other reforestation activity in Africa, or list is long life. But this one we are doing inside Europe, it doesn't make any sense. Why can't we change the rules that the whole planet is action planet, or where we can do the actions?
Thank you. Planet Review.
Hard to add to what you're correct in analyzing. I would say that you should not measure Europe's importance only by the 10%, but by the example we set, the solutions we offer, the going ahead. Also Germany, some politicians say, well, we are big, but we are not that big, and not much of the solution can come from us, which my answer is always, it's not only what Germany in numbers contributes, but also the leadership, the know-how, the example, the values that stand behind that. And I think the renewable energy revolution around the world show that what leadership requires. I'm very much with you, and of course there are many attempts through development aid combined with climate policy to bring a planetary approach to bear, particularly also with the developing countries. We were both with the World Bank. The World Bank is now very much committed, and many of the regional development banks, to the climate agenda. Big money leveraging up private investment then in those countries, big multipliers, and doing what you tried to describe. So I'm very much for global action. I mentioned some of these coalitions, China, Europe, California, for example. It's impressive when you go to California how advanced they are, in many areas more advanced than we are in Europe, carried by the people, by the consensus people. And I mentioned the emissions numbers, the emissions trading and so on. We need many more of those coalitions. I find city mayors a very interesting way to globalize, and that's what Bloomberg does with his compact of mayors. all the big cities now in the world. They are close to the action. They can do things. They can learn from each other. We need much more of that. But in all of that, I believe we Europeans should lead in our own best interest and for the world. So that's not the full answer to your question, but and I'm not an expert on your cooking oils and what we are importing or exporting there. You have to explain that to me at some point a bit more.
Thank you. Now I have to ask Sinikka how much time, because in principle we have to stop at 7. It's around 3 to 7 or something like that, and I had very many hands still there and over there.
We can continue upstairs.
Yeah, but
We can take a few more.
yeah, I think that if you can,
A few more, sure.
a few more, because I wouldn't like to let down the people who raised their hands. So let's take the ones who were on this side. Please, the gentleman back there.
Thank you very much. So my name is Jan Rinkla. I'm an adjunct professor of faculty sciences at the University of Helsinki, but also officer of operations at Aue-Säätiö. And I want to especially thank Dr. Bieberstein-Koch-Weser about excellent presentation.
Could you take please the mic, because
Yeah, I especially want to thank Dr. Bieberstein-Koch-Weser about excellent presentation, and I totally like and fancy about your way forward, but I would like to expand it. So that now we are looking at charismatic pieces. We are quite often forgetting that the Arctic is changing twice as rapidly as the rest of the world. And the sea ice hosts what some of my colleagues call non-charismatic species, because you cannot see them by the eye. And you have a vast number of cryptic species, which is meaning non-identified species, which host also potential for bioprospecting. And therefore your schools could be also advanced to these indigenous people living in the Arctic regions. And that would be my solution for that, or suggestion to improve. And then I had a comment, if I understood correctly, about Elizabeth Bain's comment about stating that there's a place where you can make your opinion about the big emissions. Well, unfortunately, I don't think that we can rely on opinions, and that's because it would lead into endless debate between countries and regions and politicians and parties. And that's why in Europe we are building this ecospheric integrated carbon observation system, which would be, once fully operational, then we can have real-time emission reports and stating where they are coming, but also at the same time about the sinks. So I think that people are still quite unaware of that, and then we can sort of start really debating on these issues and problems with the trade.
Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
thank you. Fact-based. Would you like to comment?
I'm not sure acoustically I caught everything, but I would like to say your comment about the Arctic resonates very much. I was just yesterday on a panel. We were looking at different studies, and there are some on the Arctic deep sea which already gets polluted by plastic and microplastic before we even know the full biodiversity there. So what happens in the Amazon is very much a mirror image of what we do elsewhere on Earth. The pace at which economic drivers push things ahead is much faster than what we put into research. And we need not so much fundamental research, but applied research and loop into politics and policies needs to become much faster. And that's true here just as much as over there.
Thank you. And now let's go to the right-hand side, and I think I saw Christian Breyer there. Please, Christian.
Christian Breyer, Lund University. Many thanks for your impressive speeches. I've 2 questions, one for each of you. And those address hope, so do we have some hope? And what is needed to get the entire, let's call it, defossilization process drastically accelerated? Because this is finally needed. We know we would better live in a 1.5 degree world, and the 2 degree world should be more the backup option, let's say. But for that, we need to have a kind of a zero emission system around mid of the century, and we should be rather fast there, so that we roughly know. And now it started in the last year in Sweden, so we can be proud that it started in Europe, that school kids start not to go anymore to school on Friday, but to demonstrate, or to be on demonstration in front of the parliament and make clear we are the generation where we have this wrecked planet in the end. So why you cannot speed it up? And her speech at COP24 in Katowice was, from my point of view, the most impressive speeches I saw in the last years even. So the question is, and now we saw last week 30,000 school kids in Germany on the street, maybe tomorrow the next tens of thousands. So if such a movement would be, life longer, so with a continued pressure on the street, and all of the arguments are outstanding perfect, everything is perfect what they say, what is then the reaction of a political system? They cannot be against them and they cannot ignore them if tens of thousands in different countries, in different continents in the world really go for demonstration. So could be that finally the tipping point to get really an accelerated reaction. So this is my first question. And the second question is, we know from all the last decades, maybe even longer, we lost huge areas from rainforests all over the world. It's not only in Latin America, it's also in Southeast Asia and in Africa, in other regions. What would it take to get such areas? Because the areas are still there. And as you mentioned, very often they are more or less destroyed or abandoned land, or can be not really used anymore well. What would it take to get these areas back to rainforests? Assume we would have resources, we would have water, we would have a good plan, we would have willingness, and we would like to go for a decade. How long it takes to get it back to rainforests? Because we discuss very strange, artificial, negative emission technologies, but what is the real potential of afforestation in areas where we know these forests would grow, because they have been there in the last decades or 100 years ago. So what would it really take to get from ground zero back and a real living rainforest? Is it even possible, or how long it would take?
Who would like to start? Maybe I start with this. If you go to Rio de Janeiro, there is a beautiful forest below this big Christ statue, the Floresta da Tijuca, and it is totally afforested area by the first emperor of Brazil. This was denuded. Nevertheless, it's never going to be the same thing as before, and this is what, for instance, the Smithsonian had a minimum size, still have research project in the Amazon. And they just look at how much contiguous space do you need to keep, even if you don't deforest, certain species. And if you have totally deforested and it's not the indigenous model with the forest all around, it's difficult. But, of course, it's never black and white, and there's hope. So personally, I've been engaged with Sebastião Salgado, the famous photographer, who inherited a completely devastated 600-hectare farm, red soil, from his grandfather in the Atlantic forest region of Brazil, which is also one of the originally highly biodiverse regions. And he looked at this and he said, look, when I was a child, there were cows grazing here, this was a farm, and it went down as the whole region, the farmers have become impoverished, the water level is further down. And he started 20 years ago, Instituto Terra. You can look it up on the internet. And you can see a very clever presentation. What did this thing look like in 2000 or 2001? And with the replanting of native species from the area, it's a forest again now. And of course, that forest is much more interesting than adjacent forests with eucalyptus trees or mass-produced clone pine trees. So the quality of afforestation makes a huge difference. And there are positive examples where you could say at least they got 50% of the ecosystem back and it wasn't so difficult.
I think it's very encouraging. I was absolutely exciting to see how students demonstrate, and to hell with it if they miss school. I mean, they are fighting for something much more important than and in fact that in itself is how important it is for them, because of course they miss school hours for good reasons. I think if this became a well-organized global thing, it could be extremely powerful if the young generation stood up. Actually, I thought for quite some time already, why not more of this, say the below 20-year-olds were moving on that. So everything that can be done to organize. I think the situation is so serious, and I say that only with little hesitation, that it requires extreme measures. I think some civil disobedience has to be. I mean, we have seen that in social movements, the labor unions in the last centuries to other things. This is equivalent to the social fights the last centuries, workers' rights and all the rest, to repeat some of what worked then in a modern way. Of course, the internet and many other tools are available. I mentioned before litigation. I think much more can be done. It's a very interesting example is now what's happening in Germany in banning diesel cars from the inner cities because of, in this case, air pollution, because the laws are simply not being implemented, the European directives and all the rest. I think one can marry political action with litigation action much more effectively than on. But I think the situation is serious, that everything that is campaigning, that is demonstrating, that is using these tools will have quite some impact on politicians. And not for good reasons. The Green Party in Germany is now the second largest party in Germany because they are very bold in their, they want to get out of coal immediately and many things. Inner cities and so on. They have 22% in many parts of Germany of the vote now. That's big stuff. Much of that should also happen, could also happen in other countries. But anyway, to your example, I find it great. And I would wish that these grow by every Friday. These groups will not be easy to organize these kids and how they organize themselves. Like the Yellow Vests in France and others. But here it would be for a real important purpose. And link it up internationally. Can be in China, can be everywhere. China, there are demonstrations now because of air pollution in many cities. There's also the young generation on the street. I mean, intelligence networking, maybe European Climate Foundation should get into that. But
Sorry. I just wanted to mention one more such movement, which is Plant for the Planet. It was started by the son of the founder of the Global Marshall Plan, Felix Finkbeiner. Felix, I think, was 10 or 12 when he started. And it's a huge movement of school kids around Europe, but also in other countries. And their numbers, I mean, they've planted millions of trees. And I think it's a very nice symbolic act also for kids to actually do something, not just to demonstrate, but to do something. Plant for the Planet. Again, you can find it on the web.
And we have to get at all those who call themselves climate skeptics. I mean, we're letting them get away far too easily. I mean, to say I'm a climate skeptic, even if you know better, even if it's not based on any rational analysis. In fact, in a sense, many of those are not climate skeptics, but climate criminals. And one should be much tougher in the way one goes after those especially. The Koch brothers in the United States putting hundreds of millions every year for Exxon and all that. What Exxon did over decades now, simply misleading shareholders and others and so on. This should have much larger consequences. That's why I say litigate, litigate, litigate.
Thank you. There would be one desperate question, but I'm looking at Sinikka, so I think that the discussion has to continue afterwards. You can pose your question there. I would like to close by saying that everybody has to act. I think that what you just said is good. It has to be global, national, local, individual, old, middle-aged, young, even babies in daycare centers. So I think that everybody can do something. Thank you very much for these excellent presentations and a very good discussion. And let's remember that the only thing which we cannot do is to negotiate with the planet. So we can negotiate with each other, but we cannot lose too much time. Let's act. Thank you very much.
Thank you.